Hello. In this video screen-o-matic, I will tell you a little bit about how I made my assignments, and I will tell you about the points I have made and what I thought about when I made them. So the first thing I have is my introduction. My introduction is actually the last thing I did in my assignment, and that is because I always write it after I have made my conclusion. So I would rather talk a little about my introduction after I have talked about my conclusion. The first thing I did in my assignment was to begin to analyze the text and the speech, of course. The first thing I always do when I have a speech or an article where people do arguments, then I try to find the main claim of the speaker and the sender. And I think that the main claim of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is this. I quote, "The consequence of a single story is this. It robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar." End of the quote. So the next thing I do is I try to find out how CNA, which is what I call her in my assignment, how she justifies her claims. So what I believe she does is that she uses herself a lot. She has a very strong emphasis on her ethos. So I found two examples in the speech where she uses two examples from her own life as justifications of her claims. The first example she uses is how she, from Nigeria, how she saw a houseboy they had working in their apartment, how she saw him as very poor and very miserable. He was called Fiddle. And this was because that was the only story she had heard about Fiddle. So she was very surprised when she saw that he could make a lot of beautiful things. The second example is a story about CNA's time in, Chimanda's time in the United States, where her roommate was surprised to see how well she spoke English and how tribal music was just another version of American pop culture. So, and I quote again, "My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of connection as human equals." So then I write that she uses, Chimamanda, she uses storytelling as the primary tool of argumentation. And she uses herself again a lot. And this is actually also one of the ways she engages the audience. By using herself, she becomes relatable and personal. And that is a very strong tool to use in a speech. Another way she engages the audience is by using humor. She uses humor a lot and actually does it, I think, 6 times or something. She makes jokes about her own life, about her own story, and she makes the punchlines relatable to her audience so they can see themselves in her place. And again, this further improves her ethos. It makes her more human. It makes her more relatable. So humor is a very good way to engage an audience. And that is that is one of my points. Then I talk a little about how she uses famous poets and writers as support for some of her claims. She uses Rudyard Kipling and Alice Walker, and she uses quotes from the Palestinian poet Marit Barghouti. So again, she uses humor, she uses herself, but she also makes references to writers and poets, and that again makes her very believable because she claims that she's into literature, that she's into poets. So it makes her very believable when she starts to quote some famous writers and poets. I also talk a little about how she uses her own language. She begins to talk a little about some of the words in Igbo and how it can be related to the danger of a single story. Yeah. So I also focus a little on her language. Then I start then I begin to discuss the matter of the danger of a single story and the matter of cultural ignorance. I found a very good article in the New York Times called "The Danger of a Single Story," made by David Brooks. And David Brooks has actually written this article as an answer to her TED Talk. But he wrote it many years after the TED Talk because he thought it was pretty important to talk about the danger of a single story under the American presidential election. Because David Brooks thinks that both sides of the presidency used the danger of used single stories as support for some of the claims. So I discuss that a little. I discuss how Trump used single stories about Mexicans to make them the cause of many of the problems you see in the United States. And I talk about how Hillary uses single stories about minorities in America. Because again, you do it with a good intention, but by only telling a single story, you rob minorities and Mexicans and so on from dignity and differences, because then they are only poor. You can't see them as equals or successful people and so on. So that's like the point of my discussion. And then I make a conclusion. Then I made a conclusion. And yeah, I conclude what I did, what I have written, and I end my assignment with a little quote from the text. And afterwards, I made my introduction as the last thing, because then I knew what my conclusion was, so I could write an introduction which was connected to my conclusion. So that is my assignment. I hope you like it. Thank you very much.